the more I worked on the self-awareness and the healing, there are so many gifts that came out of that. I'm able to motivate and inspire individual and organizational behavioral shifts, which is the hardest thing to do in any endeavor, in any organization. It's not about the process, the tools, the engineering. That's easy. It's the psychology, it's the human behavior. And if you have lack of self-awareness at scale, my experience is you end up with diversity inclusion issues, culture issues, and those are really hard to solve. So basically, all of the major challenges in large corporations can be solved, in my opinion, with this single program, single thread of self-awareness.
Welcome to the Work for Humans podcast. This is Dart Lindsley. We don't often talk about trauma in the context of management and leadership. What role, if any, does it play in the workplace? In previous interviews, guests have noted how much work is like a relationship. So, how important is a healthy emotional life to that relationship? Today, we're discussing trauma-informed management with Shalini Verma. Shalini's an MIT and Harvard-trained engineer. She's a high-energy leader of teams at Google, who was named to Crain's magazine Business Top 50 Technology Talent. Shalini has walked a long path from her pure engineering roots to explore the deep causes and effects of emotional experience at work, and how self-exploration can unblock the potential of high-functioning teams. Shalini and I discuss how trauma research lends itself to leadership and management, why increasing our self-awareness is the way to becoming a better leader of healthy teams, techniques and methods you can use to practice trauma-informed management, and more. This conversation was recorded last year. We've recently had a big uptick in the number of new listeners, so in addition to the new episodes dropped each week, I'm going to be bringing back up a few episodes that have proven to be both very popular and foundational to our project here of exploring how we might design better work. That way, when I refer to them in conversations, new listeners will get the reference. If you enjoy this episode, please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. And without further ado, my conversation with Shalini Verma. Shalini, welcome to Work for Humans.
Thank you.
You practice a kind of management that I would not have even imagined until I saw it. And I would like to talk to you about that. And I'd like to talk to you about the effect that it has, I think, on a workforce. So first of all, the way I describe what you do, or the word I used, is trauma-informed management. Is that an okay word to use?
It's very accurate. I think that's referred, actually, I think there's now trauma-informed education and trauma-informed. I think it's becoming a more common term. And I hadn't really characterized it that way before, but it's super resonant in terms of the way I think and operate and so on.
What does it mean?
So I would say a lot of it's, based on my own experience in trauma research and therapy, and what I started kind of bringing into my own journey that then translated to work I was doing with kids and with my staff and with inmates in San Quentin prison. And then it's been evolving in all of those realms. And what I've kind of practiced and played with over time has finally, it felt like a lot of bits and pieces that were not particularly connected, but has now really come together for me anyway, in my experience. And now what I'm actually testing and playing and sharing and educating around is very much revolves around trauma. So in particular, and I don't know how much of this you want to get into in terms of the fundamentals of trauma research and therapy and how that lends itself to leadership, management, parenting, all of the places that you can actually practice and play with this.
Well, let's start with the fundamentals because I'm not sure. I know that I wouldn't know where to start with that.
Okay, so let me just start with kind of the basics in the philosophy, in the research, which is you can kind of think of it as a triune brain. So Pat Ogden, who's one of the leaders in somatic therapy and one of the leading forms of trauma therapy now, besides, talk therapy, there's somatic therapy, talks about this. And the triune brain is basically the cognitive, limbic, and reptilian parts of the brain, 3 parts of the brain. And so loosely what they've also referred to in the past is left and right sides of the brain, left being cognitive, right being limbic and reptilian. So, there's a couple of models. This one is particularly relevant here because of the way it's applied. So the cognitive part of the brain generates thoughts, the limbic part of the brain generates emotions, and the reptilian part of the brain generates movements, sensations, and sensory perceptions. Every experience has these 5 components of the inner experience. So whether it's good or bad, these are the things that you have certain thoughts, you have certain feelings, and there may be sensations or movements or sensory perceptions that go with. When you have something that registers as trauma, and trauma is a very relative term If you look at all of the latest research and reading, there used to be like what now they characterize as capital T trauma that no one's going to argue with. War, sexual or physical abuse, everyone can agree that's trauma. They now characterize that as capital T trauma. There's also lowercase t trauma, which inevitably is just anything that takes you into fight or flight. It takes you off of center. You can now characterize as lowercase trauma. And essentially what happens is the normal function is you have an experience that's got all of these 5 components. At night when you go to sleep and you're in REM sleep, your eyes are moving left and right. It's basically that what's happening in that moment is that you're processing the memory. You're taking the left and right sides of that experience or from all 3 parts of the brain, and you're synthesizing that and storing it in long-term memory. That's the normal function, what happens every night when you go to sleep, which is why REM sleep is so critical. If you have something that registers as trauma, totally subjective and is based on how you're wired. So it could be as simple as when I was younger in 2nd grade, I remember my dad would try to tutor me and he'd get frustrated and he would do, like one of those frustrated responses. And for whatever reason, that registered as a trauma for me. So what does that mean? That means that those 5 components basically got frozen in time, stored. And in that moment, if it's a strong enough emotional reaction to it, I get really nervous or scared or whatever, then I will lose cognitive function. The left side of my brain will shut down. The cognitive part of my brain will shut down. And I will go into a version of fight or flight, basically, where typically my behaviors are misaligned to the situation or my best self. And this is an autonomic response. So I might not want to get angry. I might even be like, please don't get angry. And I can't control it. I get angry or I get sad or I get scared. Whatever happens, it's autonomic, subconscious programming kicks in because of the way that I'm wired with these old traumas that I've got. So essentially what happens is when it registers as trauma, the left side shuts down. It can't process at night normally like it does. When REM sleep occurs, there's no left side of the experience to capture. So it's not able to process it. It's considered an unprocessed memory in psychology and psychotherapy, and it's stored in a separate part of the memory network. And the reason that's so important is that I could be the leading expert in psychotherapy, but because it's stored in a separate part of my memory network that can't access all the tools and techniques I have, it's like storing it. It's like a little closet with skeletons inside it. And now anything can trigger it. So let's say in that moment when my dad was tutoring me, he happened to be wearing a yellow shirt and he was wearing a certain cologne. And I was in a room that was filled with stone walls. Now, whatever that combination shows up, I have that smell or that wall or something, who knows? Some combination of that trigger of the 5 senses latches me onto that track of that trauma. And I'm replaying that experience. I'm having the same thoughts, the same feelings, the same sensory perceptions, sensations, movements. So basically then it's like I'm reliving that experience. I'm like back to being my 6-year-old version with my response that might be like, why is she acting like that? And this is an overreaction. Like, what's wrong with her? I can't even control it. My cognitive function is shut down. I'm autonomic response. I can't control it. And I may not even be conscious of it because my cognitive function, if it diminishes that much, in the extreme case, when you have this, you have multiple personality disorders. So when you have these traumas that are so severe that you basically shut down complete cognitive function and a new form, like part of you emerges, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde may appear. That's the internal family system's mode of psychotherapy. You have all of these characters that come from these traumas. They can be triggered by any number of who knows triggers that are related to that trauma. And every time that happens, you're reliving those experiences and you're hearing those voices in your head and having those thoughts from those individuals frozen in that moment in time when you didn't process that trauma. So now what happens, if you think about it in the context of leadership, every one of us has this going on. And none of us know what the stories are and what the previous traumas are and what those autonomic responses, those neural pathways, those habit patterns, those unprocessed memories. So it has nothing to do with you. It might be just the color of your t-shirt or the way you like adjusted your glasses that suddenly, like maybe you furrowed your brow because you're thinking about something, but that suddenly triggered the memory of my father being angry with me when I didn't get the tutoring that he was giving me. And suddenly I'm responding and I'm getting angry with you. And you're like, what? I didn't even say anything, or I don't know why she's reacting like that. But so that's what's going on. But what happens there? I'll react to you. I'll get angry and upset. And then you're like, she doesn't like me. She's disagreeing with me. She's this, she's that. She doesn't, and suddenly you've personalized it. Now you're reacting to it. And ultimately what we start finding is we're not actually having a conversation. We're actually projecting our own fears or responding to triggers of our own traumas. And this becomes like the day-to-day experience, whether you're an employee or whether you're like in a family or whether you're with friends. That's kind of what starts happening. So that's what forms these personalities and these reactions. And the ability to be aware of that is power. Because once you start seeing those patterns, if you can feel safe enough, and this is where leadership comes in, one of the fundamental things we have to realize is like, there's no judgment or criticism. Like this came from a deep intelligence of trying to protect us when we were little, to like avoid us from replaying things that might have been we thought were life threatening, initially running from the lion. But when I register that as trauma, there's a part of me that's trying to survive. So now it's like just simply being curious and understanding those patterns is so much power. But it requires feeling safe, having some education, understanding of what these responses are, and then having enough self-compassion to actually like allow yourself and then start to like heal those traumas. And there's much more advanced like therapies on how to do that I've explored as well.
So first of all, you said something that I had never heard you say before, which is that it's not a weakness. And one of the things that occurred to me when you said that is that many of these things are traumas that we might have picked up when we were children, when it wouldn't traumatize us today if it happened necessarily, but because we were vulnerable, because we were children, because we were around people with power, which was our parents, for instance, we might have picked up a trauma that we wouldn't pick up today. And I'm wondering, what is the technique you use or what are the methods you use to bring this into your management practice?
Yeah. So there's a number of them that I've found to be like useful and a lot of what I do is like playing around with how do we bring these tools and techniques that I play with and have explored and have been very useful in my journey, my work with kids and inmates in San Quentin prison is like, how do we bring that into the day to day? So the things that I've tried that I've found to be helpful is like by example. So me being vulnerable and sharing when I have reactions, like being able to apologize and say like, hey, this is what was going on for me. I was having a rough day, or I just came out of a meeting where my boss yelled at me, or I had a bad conversation with someone and now I'm off. Now it's like you've said something and I'm more reactive. And being able to come back and say, like, this is what happened. This was going on for me. It wasn't you. It was something going on with me in that moment. It's things like that. I send out weekly emails to my staff and I share what's going on, like a little blurb at the top with like what's going on for me and things that I discovered or realized, failures. Like I really embrace examples. So I run experiments. When they fail, I share what failed, what I learned from it. So a lot of it's just through my own example. I think that often brings down barriers. I'm talking about my own failures. I'm talking about things that make me vulnerable and scared and nervous and angry. And especially as I've risen in the org, I think this has more impact because people are seeing that like, wow, you can be vulnerable, you can have emotion, and you can not despite, but in light of, you can rise in an organization. So I think people find that something they can connect to and relate to, and it allows for that. And then, so that's one piece. The other is in my staff meetings. I start every staff meeting with like a 2-minute, I call it 2 minutes of silence. It's basically a 2-minute meditation, kind of a chance to tune inward, like what's going on for each of us. I have everyone do a check-in. This exercise that I did when I was in the prison with EPP, Anywhere in Prison Project, which is, are you on, above, or below the line? Conscious leadership talks about this too. But essentially, where are you? And it's all about presence. How much presence do you have? So I could be having a bad day, but I'm totally present to that. And the difference is, let's say I don't have a good night's sleep and I come into the kitchen and I'm like knocking stuff around and I'm kind of like stomping through there. If I'm not present, I'm not above the line, the kids will be like, stay clear of mom. Don't talk to her. Don't approach her. Like, let her get over her thing. If I'm present, I could be like, guys, I had a terrible night's sleep. I'm in a rough place. Then they're giving me hugs. They're bringing me coffee. It's a completely different interaction. So I do that check-in with my staff. And it's optional whether they want to share why they're feeling above, below, or on the line. I open that up for them. And I'll start with examples of like, what's really going on. I'm having a bad day because my kids are giving me a hard time, or I didn't get a good night's sleep. Or I believe we used to compartmentalize. There's your work life, there's your home life. We have one life. My state of mind affects all the realms I live in. So they're all relevant. If I have a bad time at home, of course I'm bringing it into the workplace. If I have a horrible time at work, of course I'm bringing it home. You can try to compartmentalize, but ultimately your emotional state and your state of mind is going to come through. So I do that. I've also done more concrete things like in offsites and leadership sessions with my teams. I bring in frameworks around self-awareness. I'm working right now like with the Google School for Leaders, and we're doing pilots with Fitbit and other organizations. I'm bringing in researchers that help us like how to use technology. And there's much more reception to that now. So I can like even bring more of that into the workplace. So I do things like that. I think ultimately in the one-on-ones I have, that's the most powerful because that's when people can feel safe and I can create a safe space for them to open. And what I've noticed is the most powerful thing I can do is not push people to be vulnerable or go out of their comfort zone, but simply to just be receptive, lead by example, and then just be receptive, whatever they want to share. And what I've noticed is people are in different places. Sometimes they don't want to share anything. They're really guarded. They've been hurt before. They're not comfortable. It's not what they like to bring up in the workplace, whatever those reasons are, totally fine. What I've noticed over time is sometimes people will dip their toe. They see me, they hear me, they feel safe. They'll dip their toe in the water. They'll bring up something that bothers them a little bit. And then my response is everything. If I discount it, dismiss it, tell them they shouldn't feel that way or whatever version of that, that's it. The door closes and I may not get a chance to open it again. If, however, I get curious or I'm like empathic or I say things like, yeah, if I was in your shoes, I would feel the same way too. That's what I've discovered over time. Like then the doors can open and it doesn't always happen immediately, but sometimes it does. Sometimes the floodgates open and there's emotion and people get emotional. They might be tears. And I'll say, hey, I am very comfortable with emotion. In fact, I respect people that are able to show emotion. I'll say things like that. So people, and then of course, floodgates may open even further. That's a lot of the kind of stuff I think that I try to embrace in the day to day.
So it sounds like you and your team are, and maybe not everybody equally, but are essentially you're externalizing mindfulness. Like you're allowing yourself to reflect on how you are experiencing things and talk about it and voice it on a routine basis. Like there's different techniques for doing that. There's your email at the end of the week. There's your check-ins. There's your moments in one-on-ones.
Yeah, totally. And there's even things like, as an example, like another way to do this that's less frequent, but still very effective in how it comes across. I'll give you kind of how it plays out. So if you think of performance review processes, historically, these are, for me, have been very painful, awkward, stress-inducing for both the manager and the employee. So usually those are awkward conversations. They're wondering what's the rating they got and how did they do and who did better than me and what did I get cheated out of? And you're trying to think of like, okay, how do I package their general management philosophy, right? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Now, how do I package the weaknesses so that they can be digested by this individual? And what I found in every case and over time, that doesn't matter what I do. 7 compliments for 1 critique, packaging it between whatever, never seemed to work. And the higher up I go and the more ambitious, accomplished the individual is, the more they're focused on like, when is that left shoe going to fall? Like, when's that going to drop? Like, what's the one thing she's going to say that I'm not good at? They're not even listening. They can't even listen. They're so reactive at this moment, stressed, worried about how they're doing. They're not even hearing any of that. As I was going through this journey of self-discovery, I'll call it, or self-awareness, one of the things that struck me was, there's this concept in psychology where they say that when you haven't come to terms with something yourself, there's something about me I don't like. I see it out there. I criticize it. I want it fixed. Of course, it keeps showing up. And then I'm like telling them like, you need to work on this or that. You're not organized enough. You're not this enough. You're not that enough. They want to morph to it. They're trying to, do a good job. What I started realizing was, at one point I was like, I wonder if that stuff feedback I'm giving them, the stuff they need to work on, isn't feedback for them. It's feedback for me. And when I started looking at it, I was like, whoa, I can see now there's certain elements of that come back to me. When I started working on those things and healing them, then I started seeing my staff as like these incredible people with these amazing gifts. So then what I said was, you know what? I'm going to change the process. I know that's not the standard, but whatever. Showed up in the performance review process and said, you know what? Here's what I learned and realized. So I'm just going to share with you the gifts that I see and how they manifest in the workplace. And what was so interesting, now what I say to them is, there's no left shoe that's going to drop. Like, you're going to have to hear the good stuff, even if it makes you squirm in your seat. You're not going to hear any negatives. So don't even wait for it. And I said, I won't even give you that feedback. Why? Because what I've realized is, if I can get people comfortable enough, like if I come up with a list of things, okay, here's 3 things you're not good at. If it doesn't resonate with what's really going on with you, you're going to be like, wow, I can't believe Shalini thinks that. Here's 10 reasons why that's not true. That's not helping anybody. I created more charges and trauma. Or you'll say, yeah, Shalini wants those 3 things. I'm going to work on those 3 things to get a good rating or make her happy or do a good job. Nothing has fundamentally changed. You're just checking some boxes in order to make, support your manager or help your manager. So that's not good either. So then what I realized then was, actually each person has the most insight into what are the things that they need to evolve. Why? Because each of us are wired a certain way. And we know there are things that affect that. Your history or your genetics, your past experiences or traumas, the environment you're in, your lifestyle with sleep and microbiome, right, diet. But ultimately, each of us have a set of triggers that we can get clues to with things like the Enneagram. But ultimately, we have a set of triggers that we can tune into, some of which then cause an emotional response. If it's large enough, I go into fight or flight. And now I have behaviors that are misaligned to my best self or the situation. If I can make my staff or anyone feel safe enough to reflect on these emotional behavioral patterns and not judge themselves, but be curious and reflect on them when they've cooled off, you're going to have the most insight into what are the areas of evolutionary growth. And then what I can do as a manager then is support that and say, hey, if you start having these triggers or there's stuff that happens to you during your week or during your day, we can talk about it and we can process it. Like, we can talk about what's the emotion. This is the pattern. This is the routine. It's like, what is the emotion that you're feeling? And learning to start labeling it, recognizing it. And then what's the sensation? Where in your body did you feel it?
So one of the things that comes to mind for me, I'm imagining a leader who's thinking about their organization right now, and they're thinking about the possibility that this is something that their management teams could get better at. What percentage of the people that you work with are engineers? And of those engineers, how are they receiving this? This could be seen as really woo-woo and really groovy, or how is it received? And the first question is, are these engineers that you're working with?
I lead a team of program managers. So that's the first group I work with. And then we partner with engineering and product management and UX teams and so on. So we do work and interface with those. All of my counterparts that I work with are primarily engineering directors, VPs, and then product management leads. So those are the individuals that I interface with. And I bring this even in those spaces. And I will tell you that certainly in one-on-ones, I would say less in group settings is there a comfort, and not with all engineers. I mean, I would say probably it's pretty high. I would say it's not meant to be in jest or anything, but thanks to the pandemic and a lot of the stresses that people are under, I'm finding huge receptivity and a desire to have a space to feel safe enough to share emotion and to realize how useful this can be in the day-to-day operations and strategy. So business outcomes. So I think I might have shared bits of this with you. About a year ago, there was an article that was shared with me. It was called "Listening to Your Heart Can Be the Key to Conquering Anxiety." And it was in Wired magazine. I read it and I was so blown away by what I was reading about. I actually reached out to the researcher. She's now a professor of neuroscience at the University of London. And what she found in that research that was so powerful to me, and she's actually going to come to speak to the organization, and we're going to start leveraging that, working with Fitbit and Google Super Leaders and so on, is the following. Interoception is basically your ability to tune into your inner signals, whether it's pain, hunger, heartbeat, emotion. It turns out it's not that you see the snake, you get scared, and then your heart starts racing. Turns out the way it actually works, thanks to the interoceptive research, you see the snake, your heart starts racing, and then you get scared. The conscious mind is the last to know. Turns out our bodies have millions of sensors in it, in the gut, in the heart, in our skin. We're picking up millions of data points. And the question is, are we tuning into that or not? So basically what she found in her research is she had a study with 120 autistic individuals. Now, there's a comorbidity of anxiety with autism. Autistic individuals are known to lack emotion, lack empathy. It turns out they actually have, I think it's 6x the sensory perception of the average human. They're picking up those data points that most of us don't sense. If they don't know how to manage that, they subconsciously suppress the signals. Now they no longer can pick up their own emotion. And if you can't pick up your own, you can't pick up someone else's. That's what's going on. They actually have a superpower, but because of their inability to calibrate or understand it, they've basically suppressed it, and it limits all of these other functions. What she was able to find, so she had this process where she basically asked people to measure their heartbeat, and she uses a pulse oximeter to measure accurately what's the real heartbeat. She ties it to a software on her laptop. Then she'll say, for example, Dart, all right, I'm going to give you 10 seconds. Tell me your heartbeat. Go. You're not going to measure here or here. And most people are like, I don't know, guess. You just guess a number. She's like, all right, jump up and down for 2 minutes. Your heart's pounding. Sit down. Now do it. 10 seconds. Go. Usually it's pounding in their chest, but now that it's pounding, you can tune in. You're like, oh yeah, I feel it. You count it. And she's like, all right, let's do it again. Give me your heartbeat. I'm like, I don't know. Okay, jump. 2 minutes. What she found was that within 4 sessions in this study of 120 individuals, she was able to dramatically reduce their anxiety. They became so accurate, and their interoceptive accuracy improved so much that they reduced anxiety significantly. And a third of them recovered from their anxiety, and it lasted a year out. That's about to be released, that publication. That is groundbreaking with no additional interventions in that time frame. So basically, the more you're able to tune in and you practice that, what she found was as that improved, the accuracy of your heartbeat estimate relative to the actual, the anxiety would correspondingly drop with that.
Wow.
But what she was able to show is that for most humans, I think it was 4 half-an-hour sessions, it could dramatically reduce, which is awesome. Now we have a measure, we have a process, and we have outcomes that are affected by it. And what she did in her second study that was fascinating, she did a small study with a group of traders on the London trading floor. They have to make fast decisions, buy and sell decisions, ticker tape and all kinds of information flying around, make buy and sell decisions. What she found was with the same measurement technique of the heartbeat count, those that had the highest interoceptive accuracy also had the highest P&L. And why? Because what's going on is you can't consciously process that much information. Your conscious mind is too slow. But subconsciously, we're processing all of it. It's almost like we have access to supercomputers. They're not only processing all of this information subconsciously, they have an algorithm and they're spitting out an answer. The question is, are you tuned into that or not? So basically, what people would characterize these individuals as that had the high interoceptive accuracy or the high P&L was they have really good gut instinct. That's what people would say. We don't know how they're doing it. They have really good gut instinct. So basically, what she's discovered is the science of gut instinct or intuitive decision making. You think about leaders, the higher up you go in an organization, the more scope you get, the less time you have to process more information. So whether you're a good decision maker or not will determine whether or not you stay in that level or you move higher up. Those that are unable to do it, they're only expecting to make data like decisions based on hard data, but they can consciously process. If they're not tuned into their bodies or they don't have good interoceptive accuracy, they're missing. And think about it, nonverbal, we say is what? 80, 90% of communications. You're missing out on tons of detail out there if you're not capturing both. And so basically now we're talking about reducing anxiety, improving decision-making, affecting things like P&L. These are very relevant management business metrics with clinical research to back it up, metrics to like measure it, and processes to improve it. That's like awesome for us.
It is. And it leads to a question that I had, which was, if I could eliminate the triggers, not eliminate the triggers may still be there, but you're at least aware of them. The question is, what remains? One of the things is that you're more open to perceiving things that are coming from the outside and are not breaking through to your consciousness, maybe, because there's less clutter inside. And I don't know if that's an accurate way to talk about it.
Yeah, okay. This is how I believe it works based on all my reading, research, experimentation, blah, blah, blah. It's basically because of these traumas, we have these voices in our heads that come from the thoughts of these like traumas that when we frozen in time, there are this round table of characters of all the different major traumas. They say you have 10 to 12 touchstone memories that like basically end up forming your personality. So you could think of them as 10 or 12 characters, each of which can get triggered. So their voices in your head, their thoughts in your head chatter as you do the healing. And it starts with just simply becoming aware of the emotional behavioral pattern and seeing them. Often you'll start realizing when you start reflecting on it, when you cool off, and there's like a number of tools to recognize it. So we'll start with that. Once you start recognizing those patterns, you'll start noticing, wow, every time somebody furrows their brow and like folds their arms, I totally react. Or every time I'm in a meeting with these kinds of characters, I totally react. You'll start seeing patterns. And then basically it's like that can clue you in to what might be like a trauma that you had or one of these touchstone memories that created the trauma. And it can be as simple as becoming aware of it. But typically the deeper the trauma, the more like tool or technique you're going to need to heal it. So what I started noticing initially when I was just observing the patterns of emotional behavioral response is that the frequency, duration, and magnitude of my reaction would start to reduce. So it's not an overnight change, but maybe 9 out of 10 times I freak out instead of every time. Or maybe how angry I get starts to come down a little bit. It's going to be slow. We're talking about neural pathways and habit patterns. They don't change overnight. I started noticing that the number of times I freak out in a day might be less, or the magnitude of my reaction, or the duration that it lasts. And this is resilience now. How quickly do I come back to center? Then you can start looking for tools and techniques to allow you to come back more rapidly to center. But ultimately what happens, the net of it, these voices start to quiet. You heal, you process those. Remember I was mentioning how you process memories? You process those memories. They get stored in long-term memory. The voice goes away. Those thoughts go away. Those feelings go away. Those sensory perceptions, they go away. So they start to diminish. And then, like you said, it's like having a habit pattern that's ingrained in stone to being ingrained in sand, to being ingrained in water, to ultimately gone. And depending on how much you do this and how powerful the trauma technique, the more effectively you can reduce or remove that habit pattern and rewrite it now with what you want. And so basically what started happening then is as you quiet the chatter, you don't have as many conflicting voices in your head, the angel and the devil, or like, what should I do? What should I do? It becomes much more clear. I'm tuning into like what you might characterize as your best self or your higher self. So more clarity. Then I can tune into my body now. I'm not stuck in my head with all the noise in there. So now your interoceptive ability improves, my anxiety drops, health factors in all the reading and research. They found that when you have these reactions, these emotional autonomic reactions that come from trauma, and you don't process them, you don't release them from your system, they actually store in the body. And ultimately, this, we now know from the research, this leads to injury, illness, and disease. We even know epigenetics, you pass it on 2 generations, this trauma. So as you start to heal it, as you start to release it from your system, you become more clear, you have less clutter, you can make better decisions, you can tune into other signals. So this is where like intuition is actually just new science. It's not some voodoo. It's actually just unproven until relatively recently. You can tune into signals, what other people are feeling, thinking, what's in the air. We know this. When you meet someone, when you come into a room and you can cut it with a knife, they say, because it's thick. Those are things we're picking up on from our bodies. And they say this with athletes. If you look at peak performance athletes, some of them will say, people think they're running to the ball more rapidly, But those that have this sensitivity and ability to tune in are picking up on where the ball is going before people see it. So they're able to start heading in that direction before most people. So they get to it sooner. People think they're faster. In the wild, the prey that have this skill, they're able to warn the flock or the herd before the predator actually shows up. So it's a survival instinct. So there's like all kinds of examples where this starts to become really powerful. So essentially, that's the mechanism in which you start having much better decision-making, clarity of thought, understanding of what your true self or higher self really wants to do as opposed to what everyone else wants you to do or what the previous traumas are leading you to do from fear and insecurity. And then you're able to start tuning into all these signals that are already out there in the environment, from other people, from like the things that are going on non-verbally in order to incorporate that into your decision-making processes.
So I know that you and your teams have picked up a tool that my team has used, and I'd love to know how it relates to this, because maybe it doesn't relate at all, but it's the bubble chart. Maybe you could explain what it is and then how it fits in.
Yeah, it's a really powerful tool. And like, thank you so much for like sharing it with me, because I think it's something I use as a starting point as a leader and manager at every team that I've managed since I found it a few years ago from you. And so essentially it's a tool that I find to be effective in a number of applications. But basically what I'm doing is I have every person on my team fill in a spreadsheet, and I ask them to fill in what are the projects that are 5% or more of your time. If you have a bunch of different tasks, can you bundle them into a rough activity of 5% or more? If you have a lot of 1% of your time, we probably have a bigger problem to talk about. But ultimately, 5% or more like of your time projects, pop it into the spreadsheet and tell me now 4 things. What percentage of your workload is it? What do you think is the value to this larger organization, 1 to 10? What do you think is the alignment to the team mission or the ladder, the profile, your function? And then how much fun are you having? How satisfying is it, 1 to 10? And then what I can essentially see now is a bunch of things from that. One is when I take on a new team, I can't absorb 50 projects. Like it's too much as my scope grows. But now what I can say is like, wow, where are the areas that people are unhappy? Zone in on that. And it's like, it could be because they have a bad stakeholder engagement. It's not work that they like. It's not aligned to their level, whatever. They don't like that kind of work. Whatever it is, it allows me to double click and figure out where can I help them? Instead of asking them 1,000 questions about 1,000 projects, where can I zoom in to see where I might be able to help them? So sometimes I find some people like different types of things. So I can do swaps. Even just simply asking the question. The thing that you showed me that I thought was so powerful was to answer this question of how satisfying is it would get into this conversation that you've talked a lot about, which is this notion of the company's paying you a certain amount of money to do something, but you're also here for a reason. It's a two-sided market. There's a reason you're here. Maybe it's to brag about, the fact that you work at Google at cocktail parties. Maybe it's to like develop your career. Maybe it's to spend more time with your new baby, like whatever it is at that point in time in your life. What is the reason you're here? And then ultimately it's like, what I've done then through one-on-ones and through this bubble chart is to get people to think about what are the things that will help you on that journey. So for example, if your goal is to spend more time with your new baby, maybe like, so that when we plot like, so the y-axis is alignment to the team mission, the x-axis is the value to the organization. So everything that's top right would be stuff that's like high value, high alignment to the function or to the organization. And then the size of the bubble is the workload. The color is how happy. Green being you're having a blast. Red, I'm miserable. My initial question to you, actually, I think I remember is, how come everything that's not top right, which is the highest value stuff, the shiny stuff that everybody wants to be working on? Why isn't everything else red? And what I discovered through your explanations and support and doing this with my teams is that if my goal, going back to this example, is to like have work-life balance so I can spend time with my kids, then maybe the projects that are top right are going to be multiple time zones, crazy hours. I'm going to be miserable. I don't get to spend time with my kid. Or maybe, let's say it is in fact to get to the next level. Well, maybe the skill sets that I need are not in any of those projects. Now I'm wasting time. I'm slowing down my ability to get to the next level. Or maybe it requires an advanced skill I don't have. Now I'm set up to fail. The point is, it starts to identify the attributes of the next task or project on the journey for you. Suddenly it increased all the dimensions in which I could engage with my team. So instead of saying like, who wants this boring project that's not shiny? Who's willing to take it on for the team? Now I can suddenly say like, hey, has 3 of the 4 attributes you've been looking for. And suddenly like it completely changed the dynamic between us. There's a place for every project, depending what people are looking for. And now it personalizes the conversation. So just that exercise alone ramped up my PMR scores because people just love the fact that I'm even asking the question and trying to make an effort. So the stuff they hate to do, it's like now I can at least have a conversation like, is there a way to offload that, delegate that, push back on it, streamline it? Is there someone else that wants to do it? Whether or not I'm actually able to do it is almost irrelevant in most cases. And what I started getting into with the team was, what are the things that you love to do, right? This we talked about, like what takes you into flow. gets you into the zone. I don't want to hear about projects. Tell me the tasks that really like you get absorbed in. And flow is this notion of like something that's not too hard that it makes you anxious and not too easy that you're bored, but just beyond your capability. So that the simple act of doing it is so absorbing and like delicious that you don't need even the outcome to be like satisfied with it. So I would ask the team this, like, what are the things that you've ever done that get you into these flow states? And what are things that drain you, either give you energy or drain your energy? Then how much of those things do you have in your projects? So then we start completely changing the conversation around what are the things that trigger you? So coming back to this process, what are the things that trigger you and what are the things that motivate you? One of the best ways to answer those questions of how satisfying is this project is to do this inner self-reflection, self-awareness. So these tools like the Enneagram that can point you to these.
Can you say what the Enneagram is and can you spell it?
Yeah, sure. So the Enneagram is spelled Enneagram, Enneagram. It's basically a personality test for all practical purposes. Unlike anything I've experienced, like True Colors and Myers-Briggs, whatever, in my opinion, this completely blows it out of the water. And the reason is that it gets to the underlying why we think, feel, and do certain things as opposed to the what. So the premise of it is every child wants unconditional love, every adult for that matter, but starting with childhood. And because of the way we're wired, we start perceiving that our parents' love is conditional on something. Now, this has nothing to do with whether you have good or bad parents. There's no judgment here. You could have two kids, same environment, same parents, perceiving those actions in completely different ways, end up in totally different personalities. So it's not about that. It's just simply understanding what personality type you became as a result of these like assumptions. So basically what happens is the parents are doing things, the kid starts assuming that love is conditional on something. So as an example, there are 9 personality types. The type 1 will assume if I'm perfect and ethical, they'll love me. 2 assumes if I give and I'm generous, they'll love me. 3, I'm a 3. If you accomplish and you're successful, they'll love me, etc. They each have a hook that the kid assumes. And basically then the whole personality starts to evolve around that fear or insecurity. So now anytime it's triggered, now this goes back to trauma, your experiences and the way you're wired is going to lend itself to what personality type and what your ultimate fear is and what that hook is and what personality you become. So that's why this is relevant. And basically what happens then is something can trigger. It can be a look, just like this trauma research, a look, a color, a smell, anything that triggers this core fear of mine because it replays the track of this trauma. Now I'm having an emotional reaction. Like I said, if it's strong enough, I go into fight or flight, I lose cognitive function. I'm now misaligned to my best self, the behaviors I have and the situation. And that's when I run into trouble. Those are the areas of evolution and growth, et cetera, right? All the things we talked about.
So where do you see this going? Like, what's the frontier here for you? And I mean this as a management practice, but it doesn't have to be exclusively that.
So ultimately what I see this doing in the journey I've been through is that the more I worked on self, the self-awareness and the healing of these traumas that can be inherited, it can be like from our own experiences in our childhood or our even adulthood. But as I healed those, what it led to, what I discovered was like all the things I dreamed of and sought my whole life, which is connection. Because when you have more self-awareness, you have more empathy, you have more connection, more resilience. I'm coming back more quickly when I get triggered. I'm able to like have more community. It's like deeper relationships. There are so many gifts that came out of that allowed me to like deepen my own character, to develop deeper relationships, to understand my strength and resilience, like dozens that came out of that every time. So what I found, and the reason my team has grown so much is primarily because of this. I'm able to like motivate and inspire individual and organizational behavioral shifts, which is the hardest thing to do in any endeavor, in any organization. The more complex, the larger, and the more ambitious, that is the fundamental skill, which is really, really hard to do. It's not about the process, the tools, the engineering. That's easy. It's the psychology, it's the human behavior. And how do you get people to change? And it's not so easy because you're talking about neural pathways and habit patterns that have been ingrained for years. That doesn't just change because I told you to change or I want you to change. Even if you wanted it, it would take a lot of effort and energy to process those memories, change those habit patterns. So it is very concretely relevant to management and leadership. And the way I see it is the following. As you increase self-awareness, 1, it helps you, your well-being, your regulation, your sense of self, your inspiration, and so on. Then to be a good leader or manager, you need empathy. Otherwise, you're not listening to your people. You're not helping them. You're not supporting them. You're going to get triggered more frequently. Your worst self's going to appear. They're going to be more scared to share stuff with you. They're not necessarily going to be able to fail or experiment. All kinds of problems. Then how do we do inclusive product design? We wanted to design for 14 dimensions of diversity. That requires really high levels of empathy, unless you want to check a box and say I added subtitles. we're done. If you really want to be at the cutting edge of inclusive product design, you have to have engineers with high levels of empathy. And you only get that with high levels of self-awareness. So it's a staged evolution. And if you have lack of self-awareness at scale, my experience is you end up with diversity inclusion issues, culture issues, and those are really hard to solve. So basically, all of the major challenges in large corporations can be solved, in my opinion, with this single program, single thread of self-awareness, basically.
I think the way you're talking about this in relation to design is really, really important, in part because, as you know, I position managers as designers. In fact, if you look at an organization, leaders are designers, managers are designers, people are designing their own experience of work. So there's design at all of these different levels. And a critical part of design is empathy. And so if I'm your manager, I can't be empathetic with you and be a good designer of your experience unless I can knock down enough of the noise in my head that blinds me from being able to see you and being able to be empathetic with you. And so you're talking about design in relation to products. And I also think it's very relevant to the design of the experience of the employee customer.
That is absolutely true. Like if I haven't done the work myself, my ability to tune into my own emotion is off. I'm not going to be able to pick up yours. If I don't pick up where you're at, what you're feeling, what you're thinking, I can't really hear you because there's so much noise in my own brain. Basically, it's like my ability to help you align programs and projects to what you need and want, some of which we can't even verbalize. Like there are people who work for me, and because I'm able to tune in, I can get a much better sense, an intuitive sense, what they need and want. So then when I share a project or an effort or give them advice or support, the resonance is really high versus if I'm just basing it on checking the boxes or not really listening, but imposing what I think you need. Sure, you might get improvement. It's going to be a fraction. So we're talking about unlocking potential then. If you really want high functioning teams that can create incredible products, it all comes down to your ability to tune in to the individuals that work with and for you in order to really find, and all of us, there's collective wisdom here. All of us are pieces of this pie. The more all of us are kind of listening and sharing and tuning in, I mean, think about it, man. It's we could create not just cultures that are transformative, but products that go out into the world that are transformative because the resonant frequency would be so high relative to what we have now. I want to share one thing with you, why this is, I think, powerful at scale. And the reason I think I feel at Google, we make so much money from ads, right? In general, as a company, we make all this money. We have a philanthropic vision. We have access to billions through our products. Think about it, Gmail, YouTube search, and on and on. We have highly productive, creative individuals. If we could get people to, instead of comparing themselves to others and feeling like they're not enough and struggling to prove themselves and compete with one another and so on, if we could actually get them to quiet the chatter, which it all comes from trauma and the feeling I'm not enough, I'm not safe, I'm not loved, some version of that, and quiet the chatter and realize the power, superpower that lies within. We've now proving through the research and realizing that any variation of that is just simply a function of this past trauma, the filters, the lenses, the charges that have accumulated in our system because we didn't release it. But ultimately, if we can help people, which I've been able to experientially do, and now we're trying to help facilitate others do, discover that, whatever you want to call it, magnificence, power, strength, superpower within, we could turn that light outwards and literally move the needle for humanity. And I think we are in a very unique position here and in general in a lot of these places to do exactly that. And so that's my kind of secret. It's not so secret, but my mission and part of the reason I'm still here and exploring these things in my little space, in my world, can I start to play and explore that? And then just by example of how we behave and what we do, can we start to make that more contagious and more interesting to people? It's about meeting people where they're at. It's not about imposing a thing. And then finding the gateway. What is it that allows them to step into the ring or into this journey? And if it in fact works, then it's going to speak for itself. But the question is if and when you're ready, can we find language, context, tools, techniques, outcomes, whatever it is? I don't care why you get on the bus. Whatever your reason is. It could be because you want to get promoted, because you want a better relationship with your spouse. I don't care what the reason is. You're on the bus. And now if these tools and techniques actually are effective in ways that are meaningful to you in your life, that we've seen a lot of examples of, then you will naturally be inspired to continue. So that's, I think, the opportunity we have in front of us.
That is a fantastic vision. And you're talking about that actually getting built into our products, right? Actually being something that we can build into what it is that we give to the world.
Yeah. So I'm talking about doing this for ourselves first. And then as we become like stronger and more empathic and more connected, and we have more insights, we're more creative, all of the benefits that come from this type of work. Think about the product we're now able to create and what's going out into the world. Like when you have engineers and leaders that are like thinking of collective interests and have empathy for each other and themselves and for the people we're designing for, the kind of products we're going to create and send out into the world, whether they're services like these that we've tested in-house and leveraged the benefits of, to products that are outcomes of people in those states of mind and states of being, that's what's going to be the magic. That's what's going to be incredible. I believe the state of the being is what ultimately determines the resonant frequency of what's received when we create it. There's an emotional connection. There's a vibrational frequency. It all comes back to, in my opinion, the state of mind, the state of being, those that created it. So I actually think, yes, I'm talking about actually using this for ourselves to become the states of being that we would want to be as role models. And then what we embed and what we create is what we will propagate into the world at large. And we'll have similar like resonance and healing power, or whatever you want to think of it as, I think for the world at large.
I do have a last question, which I ask everybody at the end of interviews, and you may have just answered it a little bit, which is 2 last questions. What job do you hire your job to do for you?
So what I shared with you earlier, like the reason I'm still here, what really motivates me is that Google, I mean, in particular, but in general, in the corporate world, it's a pretty tough place. There's lots of ambitious, accomplished individuals. I've been a rock star everywhere I went. Now I'm a dime a dozen. There are a ton of rock stars here. Everyone's a rock star. What's motivated me extrinsically, always, no longer relevant. I don't get the same kudos and recognition reward because I'm a dime a dozen. So now it's like, what am I going to lean on? How am I going to feel self-worth? And I crashed and burned big time, fell flat on my face here multiple times. As I said, it's like, that's the very thing that allowed me to like do the work, to look at the reflection, to do the self-awareness work, and then the journey, and to really discover and heal these like traumas and discover the great strength that lies within that doesn't require, I won't say I'm devoid of it, but loosen the grip of the extrinsic validation and motivation and support. The thing that's become so incredible for me and why I love to work here in particular is that as I've gone through this journey, what started to shift for me is that I see challenges and like failures and trauma as like perfect designs for my evolutionary growth. So it's not about being afraid anymore. It's a little bit like the way I want to live my life, and I get to do this here. I get to run this experiment and play in this laboratory, is dream big. What do you want to do? Where do you want to go? Like, if you didn't worry about failure, the standard questions, what would you do? How would you live? Then it's like, go after it. Unabashedly, like, go after it. When you fail, not if you're really pushing the envelope, you should fail. When you fail and fall, it's like, I think of myself as a scientist. It's like, I have a hypothesis, I run a set of experiments. If and when they fail, it's more data. I might reform my hypothesis and I run a new set of experiments, but I am seeking the truth. Failure is a part of that journey, a necessary part of that journey if I'm really interested in finding the truth. So what's great about Google is that there's no standard hierarchy. There's no standard processes and structures. It's like the Wild West. And all of it's about not mandating a process or a direction, but you have to inspire individual and organizational behavioral changes. I've never had to do that anywhere. Usually top down, we're doing this, jump, how high has been the usual MO. Now that's sure there's some influence but never to this magnitude have I had to lean in to be successful, lean in on the ability to drive individual organizational change. And it all comes back to work on self. What it allows me to do is keep working on the instrument so that I can pick up and I can like now use this for higher purpose, whether it's like helping to heal humanity and starting small, not too grandiose. I'm not here to fix anybody, but really it's like, can I become the catalyst or the instrument that creates spaces that people can start to find their own path and their own journey and tune into themselves, not needing me to do it for themselves. Like that's really why I'm here. And that this is a perfect place to do it. One, it's a pretty tough environment where you have to leverage those skills to be successful. You have to learn them. They're not overnight skill sets. We're profitable enough that we have the luxury to play, to try, to fail. Like you don't always get that. I've been in a lot of companies where you're fighting for profitability. That's not a luxury you might have quite as much. What it allows me to do is to like, I think, live my life in the way that I aspire to more and more, which is like open heart, clear mind. And it's like going after like craziest, wildest dreams, failing miserably, learning a ton through the process. It's like life becomes like this just joyous experience. So for the first time, I would say, in my experience working, I'm like having so much fun.
It's a really dynamic answer. I'm going to have to think about it for a while because it's almost like you're using your job as a forge to remake yourself. And those two words are not quite right. But this idea that by being in a place where you can be pushed and also be safe to fail and get up again and keep moving, you're able to evolve more quickly, create yourself, discover yourself more thoroughly, and therefore create more value in the world.
Wow, I love that analogy. It's true. It's resonant.
And this is the question, this is the new question I ask now, which is, what does your job cost you?
Well, I have a set of gray. I joke around that I started here with a set of black hair, but I guess that's an interesting question. I mean, because I see it in a very different light. Like what costs me now is actually perfect for like the things I would consider a cost are actually the exact things that allow me to evolve and grow. So I see it in a different light, but it does mean on a regular basis, I'm putting myself way out there for critique and criticism. I mean, the way I operate, my management style is not common. I get vulnerable on a regular basis with people that are uncomfortable and judgmental, critical of emotion and this way of operating, like too touchy-feely, and you're cutting them too much slack, and you're babying them, you're coddling them. Like that's not how leaders are formed. So what it requires me to do is like have enough confidence, increasing that I don't worry about that as much because I know with so much more inner conviction and confidence that this way of operating and living is exactly what I think makes life meaningful, makes work meaningful, helps people. And I've seen it enough times within myself and others that I've started looking at like the characters that challenge me and push me and trigger me as, for lack of a better word, angels on my path that are going to help me see the places I need to work and do the places I need to continue kind of evolving. So there is a cost. There's definitely a cost. I'm still a major work in progress. So I'm affected. When you're pushing the envelope that much and you're like putting yourself out there, but not the perfectly forged instrument yet, there's a toll that it's taking. There's potential trauma that's being created. So there is a cost, but I think it's a worthwhile one.
Yes. And a part of the reason I asked that question is that I always used to ask the question, what job do people hire their jobs to do for them? But that wasn't getting at what do they pay to buy that thing? And so a part of what you're saying is that what you pay to buy that thing is this personal risk of exposure. And it's kind of scary sometimes, but you feel that it's worth it. And so, in fact, I would say it's an interesting idea that you hire your job for forgiveness. Here's why I'm saying that, which is that if you didn't have a job where you could fail and get back up, or where the definition of success was so narrowly defined that it was like this rope walk that you had to do, you wouldn't be a place that was safe to be vulnerable and a place to do that. So that's an interesting possibility that you hire your job for forgiveness, tolerance.
Forgiveness is an interesting word because actually a lot of what this requires, this process, this reflection on emotional behavioral pattern, healing trauma, requires forgiveness of self-compassion. Without that, this is impossible. If you judge yourself, you're just creating more trauma, actually. Like you're not going to heal. You're not going to see the intelligence and the beauty of your response. You're not going to be able to change it because as long as there's judgment, you're not going to be able to heal. So I think it's a really interesting point because it's maybe you hire your job for like, how much presence can you contain? Like, can you move into the eye of the storm? That's like equanimity. Maybe that's what it is. I'm not sure yet. I have to think about it. But as I go through this process, what I can withstand, the storm I can tolerate, and the amount of time, like they talk about wicked environments in like range and so on, is like, I guess I could call it faith, but confidence that when I go into the darkness, when I go into the storm, when people are like out to get me or attacking me or giving me a hard time or whatever it might be, I have enough confidence now that I can move through it and embrace and honor everything coming up: anger, fear, shock, sadness. And I know with full confidence, and it's what allows me to completely like unleash whatever's coming up. When I move through that shadow and that experience, there are going to be incredible gifts and learnings and evolutionary growth. And so it's like that knowledge that allows me to go longer or to go deeper or to like take higher risk, go further out on the limb and so on. So ultimately, it's like equanimity is a word that's coming to mind for me because it's about that art and that practice of like moving, not jumping. You have to go through the storm to get to the eye. So it's like, how well can you learn how to do that?
And do you feel like you have to think about there are people around you who might have to go through that storm? And when do you push people into the storm? And when do you pull them out, I guess? Do you have to manage that?
This is a really good question, actually, and something that I like is part of, I'll say, my struggle and my growth, which is ultimately it comes down to what needed in this moment. Can I be present enough and clear enough and tuned into the signals enough to know what's right in this moment? It could be that I'm just simply here to hold a space for you. I'm not here to fix you or heal you. That's totally egoically driven, potentially. Like my need to fix you and heal you and get you down a certain path. That's coming from my own fears and insecurities. That's not really for you then. That's for me. So then it may just be that I'm here to hold a space for you so that you can continue on your journey and find a glimpse of that like safety. It could be that I need to jump in and push you. Maybe I need to nudge you into that darkness because you're on the edge, you're on the verge, and I know it's going to help you. Maybe it's like holding the space when you've fallen into the darkness and just being there to hold your hand or to be there beside you so you know you're not alone and you're able to go through it on your own. Maybe it's just to be an example of what's possible. I've sometimes even like stood and observed people who go into dark spaces, even though every part of me is like, I know what it would take to fix this. I know the quick fix, but actually it's the journey. It's going through it for them. So a lot of it's about honoring. And the more I clear, the better I'm able to do this because I'm clearing my fears and insecurities and my need to like project and solve and fix and heal. It's a practice. It's not easy to do that.
Thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about this. Every time I talk to you, I walk away thinking something sort of like I'm a caveman or something. Like there's so much to learn in this. So thank you very much for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me. I will say that the fact that you're picking up and even asking these questions and like tuning in, I mean, I'm quite sure your gut instinct and intuition is pretty high up there, despite what you might feel. So I really appreciate the fact that you're willing to tune into that and share it with others.
Thank you. We'll talk soon.
Sounds good.
Thanks for joining me for another episode of Work for Humans. If you enjoyed this episode, please give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. And share the show with one person you think would get value from it. Believe it or not, this really helps us grow the show and reach more people who want to build the kind of work that people really want. As always, thank you to my producer, Jason Ames at Ninth Path Audio for his insights into content and his high standard for quality. Final note, the opinions shared here are my own and not the views of Google or Cisco Systems. Thanks again for listening. See you next time.